On February 26, 2023, a boat carrying around 200 migrants sank off the coast of Calabria in southern Italy while trying to land on the coast of the seaside resort Staccato di Cutro. The shipwreck resulted in the deaths of at least 94 people on board, mostly from Afghanistan, and has raised questions over how EU border agency Frontex and the Italian Coast Guard responded to this incident. I am Evi Chiori. Hello and welcome to Euractiv.We's Beyond the Byline podcast. The ongoing investigation on this story paints a different reality from the one presented by the official authorities, and our reporter Eleonora Vasques brings exclusive information about the real conditions of the shipwreck and the decision-making of the authorities. Eleonora, you cover migration for Euractiv's Politics Hub, among other things. Tell us what happened and what exactly is that we're talking about today.
So a Frontex plane intercepted a migrant boat that supposedly was assessed as a possible migrant boat because thermal camera signs showed at the time that there was a strong thermal response. So there were probably a high number of people inside the boat. But after that communication was passed to Italian authorities, the Italian authorities decided to start a law enforcement operation because since the boat was sailing normally, even though there was a four-state sea, which is usually of waves between 1.25 and 250, it was not considered a distress case.
And just to make this clearer, because you're talking about these numbers, 1.25 and waves, but what do these numbers really mean?
So the sea is classified from state 1 until basically state 7. It's divided as such based on the meters of the sea level. So for state is between 1.25 meters and 2.50 meters. Considering that as a post-assessment, many experts, journalists, NGOs look at the case as of course, a distress case because it was an overcrowded boat and there was evidence to see that was possibly an overcrowded boat with a four-state, so the waves were
quite high,
but it was sailing normally. And based on that, the authorities decided to not start a search and rescue operation.
Okay, so could we say then that everybody was alerted except the authorities?
No. The authorities were alerted. So basically, just to explain, I'm sorry, it's very operational and it's very detailed.
And believe me, we really appreciate the explanation.
When there is a case and it's intercepted, Frontex alerts the authorities that can be competent. So in that case, the Greeks and the Italians were alerted because the case was near that coast. So after that, the authority that decided to coordinate any kind of operation decide to classify the kind of the case. So in that case, Italians decide to start a police operation, but the boat has to return to the port due to the sea condition. The day after, there has been a shipwreck because, of course, there was a rock that was hit and was not visible, and almost 100 people died, including several children. That was, of course, a very controversial case because the boat was intercepted hours and hours ago, and from some point of view, there were already the characteristic to start a search and rescue operation, which didn't start it.
And Eleonora, you're here to explain to us why wasn't this the case and what stopped the operation. And you have an exclusive on this from the authorities. So what is the new information on this?
In the document was basically revealed, which is the incident report of Frontex on the shipwreck, because, for example, about the context, Frontex does an incident report in this kind of cases when they are involved in a case that finished in tragedy, as, for example, also the Pylos shipwreck in June 2023. So, and in the report was specified that in the headquarters of Frontex in Warsaw, there were two representatives of the Italian authorities, the Financial Guard, so the Guardia di Finanza and the Coast Guard, that when there was the sighting of the boat, so we said the case was intercepted by the plane, the communication went to Warsaw headquarters in Frontex, and the Italian authorities communicated to the team leader of the monitoring room that was monitoring the case that the case was not of interest. So based on that, Frontex then communicated via email a report of the sighting to the Italian authorities, but at the same time, the report specified that the authorities in the Frontex headquarters, which said that to the team leader, were in constant contact with the Italian authorities over the phone.
Sorry, but I have to ask, how did you obtain this information?
Well, this is a very spicy question. It's when I started to follow this case, when there was the shipwreck last year in February. And since then, I started to investigate the case to see all the operational details and to study the context of the operation. So my first skill, I would say, is to study in detail as a nerd, each detail of how to do and which are the protocols for this kind of cases. And second of all, I started to publish, developments of the story at the time. And then I start to reach sources and to understand how and in which context I can ask for documents. And at the end, I obtained it.
Mm-hmm. So what was the case then? Who took the decision?
From my understanding, when Meloni said that they didn't had any emergency communication from Frontex, because she said that after the shipwreck.
Alle nostre autorità nessuna, diciamo così, comunicazione di emergenza da Frontex.
My understanding is that it was decided on the spot by the Italians to not start the operation of search and rescue because the case was not of interest and Frontex was only providing assistance.
We do not coordinate rescue operations. That is the task of internationally recognized maritime rescue coordination centers. Let us focus in particular on the tragedy of Crotone. In the late hours on Saturday, one of our planes spotted a boat heading toward the Italian coast. Using our thermal cameras, we detected signs that there might be people below deck, despite there being no obvious signs of distress.
Hans Leitens, Frontex director, said during the Libe committee hearing earlier this summer, explaining how Frontex operated in this case.
Frontex is only an agency and is not sovereign, and Frontex cannot make decision on which kind of operation to start.
Right, so the decision was made that this case was not something of interest. But under what circumstances or requirements did the authorities decide that this was less important, let's say?
My understanding at the time, before looking at that document, was that since the boat was sailing normally, there was not a risk of sinking when the boat was intercepted that could go without problem. The real problem is that, just a personal parenthesis, I've been on the Ocean Viking NGO boat and I saw when these cases are intercepted, or I've seen the condition of these boats.
Right, and in what cases did you see these boats being intercepted? When are they considered of importance?
Any migrant's boat should be classified as a search and rescue operation because also in the report of Frontex is written that these cases can escalate in a few seconds in hundreds of deaths because these boats, they don't have a prepared crew.
They don't even have a crew.
Absolutely not. They usually have a person that the traffickers give the command of the boat, but most of the time there are people that they don't even know about what's the color of the sea, because it's the first time they see the sea, for example, when, for example, they depart from Libya or also Tunisia.
And this is a very important point you're making.
Whatever can happen and finish in tragedy, and many people die because most of these people, for example, they are not able to swim. In the Mediterranean, we have a culture of swimming that every kid more or less is able to swim. It's not the case of many African countries where, or for example, I've been also in Asia recently, there are a lot of people that are not able to swim even though they have the sea nearby because there is not a culture of swimming.
And if they manage to cross the Mediterranean, they reach Italy, who has now a stricter migration policy, especially now that Giorgia Meloni is leading the government.
Vuole fare questo governo è andare a cercare gli scafisti lungo.
So what we listened to here was Giorgia Meloni during a press conference after the shipwreck, vowing to fight smugglers on land and sea. So what's the current situation with Italy's policy on migration?
From my point of view, migration policy, in particular, I would say the search and rescue habits in Giorgia Meloni's government are in continuity with what happened in the past with the previous government.
Now, let me add to this mix EU's migration policy. In December, we had the Migration and Asylum Pact that has raised eyebrows and many questions about human rights violations, not only from NGOs and activists, but also from academia. How do you see this developing, especially now that we're ahead of the EU elections in June, where we expect more right-wing MEPs getting seats in the European Parliament?
The pact is composed of 5 regulations, and it will give overall management of migration. And when it comes to migration, it means borders at EU level. And this reform now, it's working on the European Union is working on the technical steps, which will be also political, and it should be approved. The last steps should be approved before the end of the mandate. Having said that, the reform reflects an European Union which is very conservative toward migrants, and the migration pact reflects exactly the needs to keep migrants away. So there are a lot of border procedures that basically step up on returns and trying to deny the access of borders, of European borders, to many people arriving in European soil with an irregular status.
And I think EU strategy has also been focused on its external migration control project. Ursula von der Leyen promised 100 million euros to Tunisia.
The 4th pillar is migration. We both have a vast interest in breaking the cynical business model of smugglers and traffickers. It is horrible to see how they deliberately risk human lives for profit. So we will work together on an anti-smuggling operational partnership, and we will support Tunisia with border management. This year, the European Union will provide 100 million euros to Tunisia for border management, but also for search and rescue and anti-smuggling and return.
And earlier this month, you reported that the EU is planning to grant 87 million to Egypt. So what else can we see on that front?
The agreement with North Africa countries, for example, in search and rescue activities has as a pillar the Libya pattern. So to create a fake, basically, coast guard that intercept migrants and bring back to Libya, where they face tortures and abuses daily. This is a pattern that it's occurring also in Tunisia and in Egypt.
And Eleonora, what takeaways would you like us to take from this topic?
Try to find a few reporters that you trust, or NGOs, or any other way to feel comfortable and to understand how these procedures are ongoing, because it's very complicated and it's not simple and immediate as most of the politician and political landscape wants to depict.
Thank you very much, Eleonora, for joining us on the podcast and for sharing with us your exclusive story. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Beyond the Byline podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up to our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.